Scripture today is taken from James chapter 1, beginning in verse 13 through 21. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when, by his own evil desire, he is dragged away and enticed. Then after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. My dear brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry. For man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. The word of the Lord. Please be seated. James says in the first 12 verses, said, you're going to have problems. You're going to have trials in life. Up through verse 12. And then in 13 and following, he says, now you're also going to have temptations. You're going to have trouble inside as well. Same word in the original text. It's sometimes hard to distinguish between trials. You know, are they from the outside? Are they from the inside? These tests, these trials, where do they have their origin? Verse 2 through 12 seems to say they're from the external, from the outside, looking in. And verse 13 are from within. James doesn't say if you're tempted, but says when you're tempted. So temptation's a given. It's what you do with it that matters, doesn't it? You'll either overcome it or you're going to sin, and there's no neutral ground with temptation. When serving as an on-call chaplain, staff chaplain in Scott and White for a number of years, I remember once about 2 a.m. I was called to a patient's room, and I got to the room and I found out before I went in the room that the patient had a brain tumor. It was about to undergo surgery in the morning, just a couple hours away. And I went in the room. It was subdued light. I mean, the guy was sitting up in bed. He was just overwhelmed and overcome. He was crying and had been crying. And there were books everywhere. And I noticed the titles of some of them. There were theological books, stacks over here on this table and by the window. And over here there were several versions of the Bible. And what happened was, and he told his story, that how a decade earlier he had been completely healed in a religious service of a brain tumor. And now, after being away from God for a number of years, it had returned with a vengeance. And he had gone from a spiritual stress, we say, to spiritual distress, to now a spiritual crisis in his life. And he was wondering about all of this, how God fit in. And he decided in his heart that God was punishing him for being away from him for those couple of years. He had been being paid back for his misdeeds. And that's the way people are in the middle of a crisis, serious illness or a loss. Many times they're challenged in their faith, what they believe about God and his sovereignty and how he fits in. They ask those questions, those why questions, about why is this and why me and why now? And sometimes apologetically state to me, and you've probably had this happen too, people will say things like, well, I know I'm not supposed to question God, and I want to say, well, who lied to you? Who taught you that? It's not a lack of faith to question God. You don't question somebody that's not there, and you're in good company with the psalmist who cried, how long, O Lord, how long? And with the one who on the cross said, why have you forsaken me? I don't go there immediately, but that's where I want to go eventually. So James, first of all, says, and talks about the blame. He says, verse 13, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. It's not God who's tempting you. It's not God's fault. James says it starts within. Our God is different than other gods, isn't he? He's not like the gods of the Greeks and the Romans that messed with people to entice them to do wrong. Genesis 3, you recall the story of the first temptation where God had said in chapter 2, verse 17, that don't eat of that tree in the middle of the garden or touch it or you will surely die. And then whenever he called them and they hid, and God said, "Where are you?" So of course he knew where they were. He wanted them to recognize that. And Adam said, I heard you, and so I hid. And he said, "Why'd you hide?" "Because I was naked." "Who told you?" "Have you eaten of the tree?" And you recall that there was a lot of blame going on. So Adam blamed God and Eve, and says, "The woman you gave me, she gave me the fruit and I ate." And Eve turned and blamed serpent and said, "The serpent enticed me and deceived me, and I ate." And that old Warren preacher's statement, that has been said, that Adam blamed Eve, Eve blamed the serpent, and the serpent didn't have a leg to stand on. It's true that old preacher told me, wait about 20 years and there'll be a new generation to laugh at the same old jokes. So don't blame God. And people, people don't normally blame themselves when they're in trouble, do they? I tried this out yesterday morning. It was one of those occasions where you're given an opportunity to fill in for a fill-in in church, for a class. And so I was filling in for a teen class, and I thought, well, this is a good place to try this out. And so I just asked the question before we opened the text. I said, when people have trouble, who do people blame when they're tempted to sin? And one girl, smart as a whip, she didn't miss a beat. She said, "Well, God." And I said, "How's that?" And she said, "Well, people say I can't help it. God made me this way. It's His fault I'm like this." And I thought, she's wiser than her days. When people do something wrong, the easiest thing to do is to blame somebody else. People in counseling rarely say, "Well, it's my fault. We're having problems in our relationship because I'm just such a jerk." Who does that? We just don't do that. "I'm this way because of my parents," or we'll say, "I robbed this bank because of my upbringing, or because of my wife, or my environment, or my preacher, or my elders. They're the ones that are the problem." Ultimately, people sometimes even blame God, and he says, don't do that. And then he talks about the bait. He says, each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he's dragged away, he's enticed, and the idea is lured. I do a little fishing, and it's amazing to me. You take this 6-inch piece of plastic, and it has to be watermelon seed color, a little dark green with little red flakes in it. And you put this bright red curved hook in the middle of it, and they call it a wacky worm, and about 12 inches above that you put a little weight on it and stick a little toothpick in it and break it off, and then drop it about 10 feet of water just over that nest of that sow bass, and hopefully, as you pull it up, there'll be something heavy on it, and maybe a 3 or 4 pound bass. Usually isn't. But fish are stupid. It doesn't even look like food. You spray stuff on it called attractant. It stinks to high heaven, and you think it doesn't even look like food, and they go for it. But we're not much different, are we? We go for stuff that really isn't going to give us life. Oscar Wilde says, "I can resist anything but temptation." And I think we could all agree. Sin starts in the heart, he says. It starts in the heart. Satan may tempt you, but you're still responsible, he says. And so then we need to be different than fish, but we're not much different. We look for things and we grab on to things that aren't real. The thing that we think will give us pleasure or something better, and that it won't truly satisfy, won't give us real life. We don't see the consequences behind it, do we? You don't see the frustration because you're going for the bait. You don't see the failure. You don't see the alienation from God. You don't see the drug rehabilitation center. You don't see the unwanted pregnancy, or you don't see where a little greed will lead to. And you don't see how that lust will destroy your marriage. That innocent flirtation, which is an oxymoron, right? Temptation is a shortcut to your goal. Someone said, sow a thought, reap a deed, and sow a deed, reap a habit, and sow a habit, and reap a destruction. But he says here, he says, Verse 16, put the brakes on it. Don't be deceived. Don't be deceived. We need to learn to say no, don't we? Sometimes it's hard to do that. But you got to put it on early. You got to put those brakes on early. Really ask, what would Jesus do? What would a Christian like me who follows Jesus do in the face of this thing? How does the Word address that I've been taught? How does the Word of God address my life in this instance? 1 Corinthians 10, I'm reminded, Paul says, no temptation has seized you. James says it lures you, and Paul says it seizes you. No temptation has seized you except what is common to man, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you're tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can stand up or bear up under it. I don't know what you're going through right now. We're all different. But James says it's yours. Your temptation is yours, and mine is mine. And he says we're all different. But whatever you're going through right now, whatever tempts you, it's common garden variety, isn't it? Because he says, no temptation has seized you, but what is common. You can't sing the blues, no one's known the trouble I've seen. You can't sing that. Remember Joseph? He left his cloak in the hands of Mrs. Potiphar. I mean, he was exiting out the door. You run from it. You don't sit and talk about it. And it's yours. And you got to take responsibility for it. Like the old Pogo comic strip. We've met the enemy and he is us. And then finally is the blessing. He says, and this is the good part. He says, every good and perfect gift comes down from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights. So don't be blaming God. He says God is not about doing you in. God is about blessing, isn't He? If you're following Him. Remember Jesus in the wilderness, each time resisting the darts of Satan with that statement, it is what? Written. Because he had the Word on his heart. So God isn't about tempting you, to bait you, about setting a trap for you. He uses this idea of birthing in both instances. One is birth unto death, which is strange language. It's like a stillbirth whenever that sin is matured. But here he says, God is about giving you birth and life. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth that we might be a kind of first fruits of all He created. So what He wants is righteous living, He said. That's what He calls us to. That we might be a kind of first fruits of all He created. So He says, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry. Righteous living is what He desires. So get rid of all moral filth and evil and humbly accept the implanted word that ultimately will save your soul. So, want to stand up to temptation? A couple of things. Rely on the word that's implanted in you. Rely on God through prayer. Verse 5 says that He gives to all liberally. If you lack wisdom in these things, He says, pray about it. And I'd add a third, and that is find somebody that you really trust, that you can be accountable to. God bless.